in the U.S. Supreme Court. Of course, they actually have oral argument less than 100 times a year. They only hear 70, 80, maybe 90 cases a year. And to think over less than a 10-year period, over a 7-year period, you were there 4 separate times arguing on behalf of the plaintiffs. Of course, it changed a lot over time. I was dropped as a plaintiff. Mel and Ruth, I guess Ruth was able to stay in. You were dropped as a plaintiff, but you were representing Ruth and Mel, who actually lived in the 12th District, I believe. So things changed, but the spirit was the same.
Yeah, it kept going, and there were 4 different appeals involved, and in one way or the other. And unfortunately, ultimately, the Supreme Court, while vindicating the principle there should be no racial gerrymandering where the purpose is predominantly racial, left open a means of evasion where the politician can say, we didn't do this for racial reasons, we did it for political reasons. And even though it's sort of a subterfuge, and that's the frightening thing, that the system can still be manipulated for the wrong purpose. And I think it's so important that the legislature of a state look at some fundamental concepts like compactness, contiguousness, community of interest, and not draw dividing lines which are bizarre.
And also at some level following TV and radio markets oftentimes. It's very difficult for someone to run, there was that 12th district that ran from Durham through the Greensboro down into the Charlotte TV markets, potentially even into the Asheville, Greenville, Spartanburg market, into 4 TV markets. For someone to run for office, they'd have to spend so much money to campaign. It makes it very difficult. Not to stay on that for long. Of course, we think about, we were at 1950 yesterday, talking about your first year of teaching there at Duke Law School. Then you joined, and I want to mention, our director pointed out that it's important for aspiring lawyers or for law students to take the time. They can go online to Oyez, OYEZ.org, to listen to oral arguments. They can listen to you. I think recently, not long ago, you listened to yourself, actually, as you did the oral argument in April 20th of 1993 for the opinion that was handed down June of 1993, that same year. I remember I was taking a summer school class at UNC Chapel Hill and was able to read about it in the Daily Tar Heel there, how exciting it was in one of the libraries over there. But it was fascinating. I want to encourage folks to go to Oyez or to go to a search engine, Google, for instance. Google your name, Robinson Everett, and they'll see one of the first 10 links is a link to your oral argument there in the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as to the other 3 times you argued cases and hearing other cases. They can go back and hear Brown v. Board of Education back in '54, or they could hear other fascinating cases over the last 50 years where they preserve the oral argument by tape.
That's great to know.
Yeah.
Is that access to history?
Absolutely. Well, let's go back, if you don't mind, 55 plus years dead to you taught law at Duke for a year, but then you joined the Air Force. Is that right? As a military lawyer?
It's ironic. The day I graduated from law school, North Koreans came over into South Korea. So I, not having been in World War II, I had a reasonable expectation I would be in the military. And then on the second day of the 3-day bar exam, I went ahead and enlisted in the Air Force Reserve, and then soon after applied for a JAG commission. And ultimately I was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Air Force JAG and was ordered on active duty in 1951 in August, and sent down to a base in West Texas.
Right.
And that was a very interesting experience, almost a different culture out on the high plains.
West Texas, yeah.
Out in the Panhandle. So I had 2 years, most of which I spent there. And then by another remarkable happenstance, well, I'll tell you a little bit about it.
Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes. Share with us.
This is so bizarre. I was getting ready to come back to Durham and practice law. I had something lined up with a law firm. And I came to Durham. Then I thought, well, I'll go up to Washington. I had a ride up there with a friend, and I'll try to get a flight out of one of the air bases near Washington to go back to West Texas.
Right.
And when I got up there, I thought, well, it'd be nice to be a member of the bar of the Court of Military Appeals. That was a court that had been created in 1951 to review convictions by court-martial in serious cases. And so I called out to the Pentagon and asked if they would take me over so I could be sworn in, if they could arrange for that. And they did. They took me over. A colonel took me over. And we go up to the chambers of one of the three judges. They were not in session at the time. And this judge, Judge Brosman, swears me in his chambers.
Wow.
And then he says to the colonel who brought me over, says, Colonel, do you mind if Lieutenant Everett stays with me, talks to me a little while? You can go back to the Pentagon if he's willing to stay. Well, those judges had the rank of a 4-star general. So there was not much question what was going to happen. Obviously, I was very happy to stay around.
Yeah.
So I go into his chambers, and he says, Lieutenant Everett, I just had a vacancy on my staff. My commissioner just left me, and I need a vacancy filled. You're going to be getting out of the military in about a month. Would you be willing to come to Washington and be my commissioner?
No.
And I was amazed.
Yeah.
Of course, I then said, well, Judge, what is a commissioner? I didn't know what he meant.
Sure.
And he called in the clerk of court and said to the clerk, Mr. Prue, would you explain to Lieutenant Everett what a commissioner is? And the clerk of court, Fred Prue, then said, well, it's like a GS-13. It is a GS-13.
Which means what for our viewers?
Well, that's exactly what I said. What is a GS-13? Well, I discovered it was a grade of government employment, but he said it's a grade you'll have, as a government employee.
And you were only 24 or 5 at this point.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm a little puzzled, and I said, well, I just don't know what a GS-13 is. I never thought of working for the government. He said, well, it's sort of like being between a major and a lieutenant colonel. And I thought, what a jump promotion. Here I am a first lieutenant. They're talking about jumping up. So I called back to North Carolina. I asked the firm that I was going to be coming with if they could delay my arrival, etc., and they agreed. And so I wound up accepting the position, spending the next 2 years in Washington.
Is that right? As a commissioner of the Court of Military Appeals.
Right, and it was a great experience.
That's amazing.
I assisted the judge in looking at the record, helping write opinions and so on.
Were they located at that time at 450 E Street Northwest, the same location? Wow.
The same location they are now.
That's amazing.
Except now they have a different name. It's no longer the Court of Military Appeals, for which the acronym used to be COMA.
COMA, yeah.
And now it's Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces.
That's right.
And CAF is a better acronym than COMA.
They just don't promote the acronym anymore. Yeah.
But in any event, it's at right there at the heart of Washington.
Oh, yeah. Magnificent location.
And it had been the courthouse for one of the local courts, the Federal Court of Appeals. And apparently the chief judge of the court knew Harry Truman, and when the court was established, he went over to the president, persuaded him to make that courthouse available. And great place to be.
It is 450 E Street Northwest, and of course the security is a lot heavier now than it was when you joined. We'll get to that probably tomorrow, Dad. We're about to run out of time. When you joined as chief judge in 1980, the security wasn't quite what it is today. The protection for federal judges may not have been as high as it is today in the the 2000s. But
and when I took the job there as commissioner, I never dreamed I'd be coming back 27 years later as chief judge.
Yeah, in 1953 and then later in 1980. We want to highlight a little bit about that time and 78, 79. We'll have to do that tomorrow. I guess Jim Taylor, if we can talk a little bit about Jim Taylor tomorrow. But, of course, the excitement for you in 1950 as you were there, and we think about Ned Everett and other persons, spectacular students who were actually older than you your first year when you taught prior to joining the Air Force. It must have been an amazing experience.
It was. I was 22. Most of the students were veterans. I was not at that time. They had a few women students, unlike a lot of law schools. When I got out of Harvard in 1950, there were no women law students.
Is that right?
They changed the year I graduated. I don't know if they wanted me out of there before they admitted women or what, but be that as it may, that was one of the largest law schools. They still had not admitted women.
Wow.
Which to me seems so strange since my mother was
of course,
a woman lawyer.
Graduated from law school in 1920. We've run out of time. Thanks so much for being with us. Will you come back tomorrow?
Absolutely.
Of course, as long as you can enjoy the great buffet here tomorrow as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much for being with us. Stay tuned to more of the Honorable Robinson Oscar Everett coming up next. We found out in Part 1 and Part 2 that his mother practiced law for 70-plus years. His father practiced law for 65-plus years. If you want to find out what Robinson Everett's ambitions are, you got to come back tomorrow for Part 3 of the Honorable Robinson Oscar Everett. Be with us.